The cold of the press was a different kind of cold. It was not the crisp chill of the agri-world dawn Arden Vihal had known all his life, a cold that promised a sunrise and the simple, honest ache of labor in the soil. This was a metallic, surgical cold that seeped from the grimy deck plates through the thin soles of his issued slippers and into the marrow of his being. It was the cold of a place untouched by any natural sun, a cold that spoke of vast, empty spaces beyond the armored hull. He stood in a shuffling line of other silent, hollow-eyed men and women, all clad in identical drab fatigues, all smelling of fear and the harsh, antiseptic soap of the processing block. Before them, a massive archway led into the belly of the Imperial Navy cruiser Emperor's Judgment. From within, a deep, rhythmic thrumming vibrated the air, a heartbeat felt in the teeth. A rating with a data slate and a face like weathered stone moved down the line, pausing before each conscript. No names were called, numbers were scanned from the barcodes tattooed on their forearms. When the man reached Arden, his pale eyes flicked up, devoid of recognition, and then back to the slate. A grunt, a gesture. Arden was pushed forward toward the arch, where a tech acolyte waited, his body a nest of mechadendrites and his face obscured by a bronze vox grill. One of the whipping metal tentacles snapped out, gripping Arden's wrist with inhuman strength, yanking his arm toward a waiting pedestal. Upon it sat a branding iron, glowing with a sullen orange heat in the dim light. The acolyte intoned a single, grating syllable of binary. The iron descended. The pain was absolute, a white-hot spike that obliterated thought. It smelled of his own cooking flesh, a sickly sweet scent that joined the pervasive odors of ozone, promethium, and stale human sweat. When the iron lifted, the Imperial Aquila was seared forever into his forearm, still smoking, the skin around it raised and angry. The mark of ship, the mark of property. The mechadendrite released him, and another shove sent him stumbling through the archway into the ship proper. The scale of it stole his breath, replacing the pain with a staggering, vertiginous awe. He stood on a gantry that seemed a spider's thread stretched across a cavernous chasm. It was a cathedral dedicated not to a god of mercy, but to a god of war and industry. The space soared upward into darkness, lost in clouds of steam and the distant, flickering glow of arc welders. Below, plunging into a dizzying abyss, were tiers of machinery, each level a frenetic hive of activity. Massive piston columns, taller than the silos of his home, drove upward and down with a deafening, rhythmic thunder. Conduits as wide as roadways snaked along the walls, pulsing with inner light and sheathed in frost. Across vast distances, he could see tiny figures, crew, scurrying along other gantries, ant-like in their insignificance. The air itself was a thick soup, the ozone. From crackling power relays mixed with the acrid tang of superheated lubricants and the ever-present, cloying smell of unwashed humanity. A low chant, a droning, mechanical litany, echoed from somewhere below, harmonizing dreadfully with the machine roar. It was the sound of tech priests at their endless rituals of appeasement. Every surface, from the distant vaulted ceiling to the deck beneath his feet, was etched with Gothic reliefs, stern-faced saints, roaring eagles, and intricate scrollwork now stained black with grime and age. This was not a ship. It was a world, a dark, breathing, malevolent world of metal and prayer, and he was now a mote of dust within its endless, grinding gears. The vastness pressed down on him, a physical weight of immutable, eternal purpose. He was no longer Arden V. Hal, farmhand of the agri-world Caltha Minor. He was a rating, a living component, a spark to be extinguished in the great, dark engine of the Emperor's judgment. The line moved forward, and he moved with it, descending into the roaring, stinking, sacred dark. The secondary plasma conduit chamber was a throat of the ship, a narrow, oppressive cylinder where the air shimmered with pent-up heat and vibrated with a deep, subauditory hum. It was a place of contained fury. Arden stood on a mesh platform, his new brand aching in sync with the thrumming in the metal beneath his feet. The walls were a lattice of thick, ceramic-coated pipes, each one pulsing with a faint, amber light from within, like sluggish blood through colossal arteries. Condensation dripped from cold-sealed joints, each drop sizzling into vapor on the hotter surfaces below. The smell was a sharper, more metallic version of the ship's general stench, laced with the cloying sweetness of sacred unguents and the ozone tang of potential catastrophic discharge. His instructor was a man who seemed carved from the same grime as the chamber walls. Ratings Officer Jaren was a gaunt silhouette against the pulsating conduits, his face a web of deep lines etched by decades of poor light and poorer air. His eyes, pale and watery, held no warmth, only a weary, ingrained vigilance. He did not look at Arden as a person, but as a faulty component that required immediate and rigorous calibration. The lesson began without preamble. Jaren pointed a bony, oil-stained finger at a bank of brass dials and rune-encrusted levers set into the wall. His voice was a dry rasp, barely audible over the chamber's hum, yet every syllable carried the weight of doctrine. Ignition was not a procedure, it was a sacrament. Jaren demonstrated, his movements slow, precise, and laden with ritual significance. First, the right hand, palm flat, was placed upon the cold, engraved surface of the main regulator housing, a gesture of humility and connection. Then the left hand, fingers curled in a specific, two-fingered benediction, traced the outline of the Emperor's aquila etched into the lever's grip. Only then could the lever be pulled, and it must be pulled with a firm, unwavering motion, exactly to the third engraved notch. As the lever engaged, a deeper chord joined the chamber's hum, and a row of green phosphor dots flickered to life along a conduit overhead. Jaren's lips moved, whispering the litany of awakening, the words lost to the machine noise but their shape a clear and necessary part of the action. A Mies-pulled lever, Jaren explained, his eyes locking onto Arden S for the first time, was not a technical error. It was an insult. A jarring, disrespectful motion could startle the chamber's machine spirit, making it petulant and unstable. The plasma, he said, tapping the side of a gently glowing pipe, was not merely superheated matter. It was the sacred blood of the ship, and its flow was governed by a semi-aware entity that demanded reverence. Disrespect led to fluctuation. Fluctuation led to backflow. Backflow led to the cleansing fire, a purging explosion that would scorch the chamber to slag, and every soul within it to ash. The terror was not of explosive physics, but of divine retribution. Next were the unguents. Jaren produced a small, lead-capped flask from his belt. The sacred oil within was viscous and iridescent, smelling of myrrh and something electrical. Application was a prayer in itself. 3 drops, no more, no less, onto the specified coupling joint. The drops had to be placed in a triangular pattern, mirroring the holy trinity of the machine, the motive force, the logic, and the immutable form. Arden watched, mesmerized, as Jaren's trembling hands performed the act with flawless, devout steadiness. The oil sizzled softly on the hot metal, emitting a puff of fragrant smoke that was, Jaren murmured, pleasing to the spirit. To over-apply was gluttony, a greedy smothering of the spirit's articulation. To under-apply was neglect, a starvation of its holy joints. Both were sins of maintenance, punishable by the spirit's withdrawal of cooperation, which manifested as seizing gears, cracking conduits and lethal radiation leaks. For hours, the drill continued. The litany of stabilization for when the amber glow within the pipes brightened. The canticle of cooling for when the condensers rattled. The hymn of sealing for every valve wheel, each requiring 7 full turns, no more, no less, accompanied by the silent recitation of the 7 mechanic psalms. Arden's mind, still reeling from the scale of the ship, now contracted to the microscopic focus of ritual. Every action was codified, every motion sanctified. The chamber was not an engineering space. It was a chapel, and he was a novice priest learning rites where a mispronounced syllable in a prayer could mean immolation. Jaren's instructions were punctuated by grim anecdotes. A man who skipped a verse in the hymn of sealing and was found days later, his body fused to a burst valve. A work gang that used secular lubricant and was subsequently vented into the void for their heresy. The stories were delivered in the same dry rasp as the technical instructions, blurring the line between manual and scripture. By the shift's end, Arden's muscles ached from tension, not labor. His world had narrowed to the pulsating conduits, the sacred levers, and the ever-present religious terror that hummed in the air thicker than the heat. He was learning the catechism of the machine, where faith was the only tool that stood between a man and a furious, invisible God made of fire and metal. The crisis began with a sigh, a deep, groaning exhalation from the primary conduit that shook the mesh platform under Arden's feet. The amber light within the thick pipes flickered, dimmed, then surged into a violent, eye-searing white. The hum, once a steady bass line, spiked into a piercing whine that felt like needles driven into the ear. Arden froze, his newly memorized litanies evaporating from his mind, leaving only raw animal fear. Around him, the other ratings did not freeze. They erupted it. Motion, a frenzy of devotion. Their voices, usually subdued, rose in a ragged, screaming chorus. The litany of stabilization, which Jaren had drilled in whispers, was now bellowed, each word a desperate plea hurled against the machine's growing wrath. Hands slapped against control panels in frantic, rhythmic patterns, the tactile benediction for a panicking spirit. A rating near a shuddering valve wheel spun it with furious precision, tears streaming down his face as he shrieked the canticle of containment. Arden's eyes found Jaren. The old officer stood at his station, his movements not frantic but accelerated, a grim and perfect pantomime of ritual. His lips moved in silent, rapid prayer, his hands applying unguent to a steaming coupling with exacting care even as the heat blistered his skin. His gaze caught Arden's, and in that watery stare was a command more potent than any shout: perform or perish. But Arden's limbs were locked. The overwhelming sensory assault, the shrieking. Metal, the blinding light, the scorching heat, the cacophony of prayers paralyzed him. He was a spectator to his own damnation. Then he saw the fumble. A young rating, perhaps only a cycle older than Arden, was tasked with the 7-turn sealing of a secondary overflow hatch. His hands, slick with sweat and sacred oil, slipped on the brass wheel. He managed only 6.5 turns before the wheel jammed. The error was small, a fractional deviation. In the roaring chaos, it seemed insignificant. But the machine, or its spirit, registered the insult. From the imperfectly sealed hatch, a jet of superheated steam erupted with a serpent's hiss, scalding the rating's arm and painting the wall behind him in a blistering, wet streak. The rating screamed, a sound of pure pain that cut through the liturgical screams. His scream was the wrong kind of scream. It was not a prayer. It was not a sanctioned part of the ritual. It was a human sound, weak and biological, and it acted as a beacon. From a shadowed access portal, 2 figures emerged, the armsmen. They were not crew. They were extensions of the ship's discipline, clad in heavy, drab carapace armor, their faces hidden behind featureless, grilled helmets. They moved with a chilling, unhurried purpose, shoving through the panicking ratings as if they were mere smoke. They reached the scalded man who was clutching his ruined arm, his mouth still open in a silent cry. There was no inquiry, no assessment. One armsman grabbed the rating's good arm, twisting it behind his back with a crisp, professional motion. The other clamped a hand over his mouth, stifling any further profane noise. The rating's eyes, wide with a terror that now transcended the plasma flare, met Arden S. for a fleeting second. Then he was dragged, feet scrabbling uselessly on the mesh, back toward the shadowed portal. He disappeared into the gloom, his fate sealed not by the steam, but by his failure to uphold the ritual. His removal took less than 10 seconds. The lesson was imparted with brutal efficiency. Technical failure was spiritual failure. Spiritual failure was heresy. Heresy was death. The armsmen were the inquisitors of this metal cathedral, and their judgment was immediate and final. As if satisfied by the propitiation, the machine's fury began to abate. The white glare in the conduits softened back to amber. The whine descended through octaves, settling into the familiar, ominous hum. The screaming litanies from the crew lowered in pitch and volume, becoming the usual whispered chants, now laced with palpable relief and residual terror. The crisis had passed. The chamber still shimmered with heat, the air still stank of ozone and fear sweat, but order was restored. Jaren shuffled over to Arden, his face a grim mask. He did not speak of the taken man. Instead, he pointed a trembling finger at the offending, still-dripping overflow hatch. His voice was a dry, papery scratch. The ritual for cleansing a profane surface, he explained, began with a recitation of the penitent's psalm, followed by the application of a special, acidic unguent to burn away the impurity. Arden listened, his blood cold, his own brand throbbing. The residue of fear was not just in the air. It was in him now, a permanent sediment settling in his soul. He had learned the final, most crucial tenet of the catechism. The machine was God, and its mercy was a fiction maintained only by flawless, terrified obedience. The taken rating was gone, but his silent scream echoed in the chamber's endless hum. A new part of the liturgy Arden would now recite in his head with every turn of every wheel forever. Time lost its meaning in the bowels of the Emperor's judgment. It became a flat, endless plane measured not in hours, but in the completion of cycles. Arden's existence contracted to the repetitive orbit of his duties, a blur of exhaustion so profound it felt like a new, permanent sense. His shift, a theoretical 8-hour period, stretched into a waking dream of fatigue, punctuated only by the demands of the machine. The great ship, an immortal leviathan of plasteel and faith, operated on a timescale of centuries, its heartbeat the slow, grinding turn of gears larger than hab blocks. Against this monument, the crew were mayflies, their bodies frail and decaying in real time. The tasks were a litany of monotony. For what felt like an eternity, Arden would stand before a bank of brass dials, his eyes scanning the trembling needles for any deviation from their sanctified arcs. Each dial was crowned with a tiny, stained glass eye of the Omnissiah, and staring into them for hours induced a trance where the needle's quiver seemed the only movement in a frozen universe. Then, the levers. Each pull was the same ritual Jaren had taught. The palm, the benediction, the firm engagement to the exact notch. His muscles performed the motions with a dull, automated precision, his mind too weary to summon the accompanying prayers with any feeling. They became mere sounds his lips made, a background murmur to the ship's own drone. The worst was the scrubbing, armed with a wire brush and a pail of foul gray slurry that was blessed as a purifying abrasive. He would be assigned to scour corrosion from sacred components. He would kneel for hours in cramped access ducts, the deck plates biting into his knees, scraping at the black, crusted scale that bloomed like a fungus on pipe joints and valve housings. Each stroke was to be accompanied by a whispered syllable of the litany of purity. The slurry dripped from his brush, eating at his fingernails and leaving chemical burns on his wrists. The corrosion was endless, a creeping testament to entropy that their tiny brushes could never defeat, only briefly appease. It was Sisyphine penance, a fight against the universe's slow decay, waged with a toothbrush against a mountain. His body betrayed him piece by piece. Sleep was a fragmented, haunted thing, taken it. A crowded bunk alcove where the thrum of the engines never ceased, and the air was thick with the snores and whimpers of 200 other men. He would jolt awake, sometimes still scrubbing in his mind, his muscles twitching with phantom labor. Malnutrition was etched into his face. The daily ration, a bland, paste-like nutrient brick and a cup of recycled water, kept his body functioning at a basal level, but a deep hunger, a hollow ache for real substance, gnawed at him constantly. His vision would sometimes swim at the edges, the glowing dials blurring into streaks of light. His joints ached with a deep, cold pain that the chamber's heat could not touch. Around him, the crew were dissolving. He saw men older than Jaren moving through their duties like automata, their eyes vacant, their movements slow and stiff. Coughs racked the chamber, harsh, wet sounds that spoke of damaged lungs. Some ratings developed a perpetual tremor in their hands, which they hid by pressing them hard against control panels during rituals. The psychological weight was a physical pressure, an atmosphere of perpetual duty that allowed for no relief, no end. There was no after the shift, only a bleary stumble to the alcove and a desperate, failed grasp at unconsciousness before the cycle began again. The ship was eternal. They were not. They were consumables like the sacred unguents to be used until depleted and then replaced. Arden found himself staring at his own hands during a scrubbing session. They were already changing. The skin was cracked and stained with grime and chemical burns. The brand on his forearm, once an angry, raised wound, was now a pale, shiny scar, just another imperfection in the landscape of his flesh. He felt a profound disconnect. The hands performing the sacred action seemed to belong to someone else, a biological machine that was wearing out. His mind drifted to the agri-world sun, a memory so distant it felt like a story about another person. Here, there was only the amber glow of plasma, the taste of recycled air, and the endless, grinding watch. The immortal ship consumed their minutes, their hours, their very vitality, feeding on it to sustain its own colossal, undying existence. He was a ghost in the machine already, his humanity eroding faster than the corrosion he scrubbed, a fading echo in the cathedral of perpetual war. The watch never ended. It only transferred from one set of failing eyes to the next, in an infinite, weary relay toward oblivion. The summons was a rare break in the monotony, and therefore inherently suspect. A deck officer, his face pinched with distaste, ordered Arden and another rating, a hollow-cheeked man named Kelm, to transport a sealed crate of inert components from the primary storage vaults to a remote workshop in the lower stern. The route would take them through Cargo Bay Sigma 7, a sector marked on the duty slate with a faded, cautionary rune. Kelm's eyes had widened slightly at the designation, but he said nothing. Curiosity was a luxury, obedience was a reflex. They collected the crate, a heavy, unadorned box that smelled of stale oil and dust, and began their descent. The ship changed as they went deeper. The well-trodden transit corridors with their flicking lumen strips and frequent patrols gave way to narrower, colder passages. The ever-present thrum of the engines became a deeper, more visceral vibration here, felt in the stomach as much as the ears. The air grew stale, tasting of ancient metal and a dry, powdery decay. Lumens were fewer, their light weak and jaundiced, leaving long stretches of gloom between each failing pool of illumination. The Gothic arches were still present, but here they were choked with centuries of cobweb-like cable runs and stained with strange, dark mineral blooms from the hull plates. Cargo Bay Sigma 7 was not a bay so much as a forgotten cavity. The massive, rivet-studded doors groaned in protest as Keln and Arden, straining together, cranked them open just wide enough to slip through. The space beyond was a cathedral of neglect. Vast and shadow-haunted, it was stacked with anonymous, shroud-draped shapes, obsolete machinery perhaps, or coffins for forgotten war material. The air was frigid, their breath pluming in the weak light of a single, swaying overhead lumen that cast long, dancing shadows. The silence was profound but not absolute. Beneath the ship's distant heartbeat, there was a new layer of sound. Scratching. It was a faint, metallic skittering, like iron nails being dragged slowly across the inside of a plasteel drum. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing in the cavernous space, sometimes from the distant dark ceiling, sometimes from the deck beneath their feet, sometimes from the starboard hull wall itself. Arden and Keln froze, the crate forgotten between them. The sound was not mechanical, not the predictable grind of gears. It was organic, intentional. It spoke of something with claws or chitinous legs, moving with patient, probing curiosity against the other side of the armor, or perhaps within the interstitial spaces of the ship's own bones. A void-born predator clinging to the hull, seeking a way in. Or something worse, something that had hatched within, an infestation grown fat in the ship's dark, unvisited intestines. The scratching paused, as if listening to their silence, then resumed, a little closer to the bay's inner wall. Keln gestured forward, his face pale. They moved, their footsteps absurdly loud on the grimy deck. It was then that Arden saw the stains. Near a support column, a patch of the deck had been scrubbed, but not well. A dark, rusty brown bloom seeped from beneath the cleaner surface, its edges feathered into the metal grain. A few steps farther, a long, jagged scrape marred a bulkhead, as if something heavy and angular had been dragged violently across it, taking the paint and the top layer of metal with it. Beside it, partially hidden behind a draped pallet, was a single discarded work glove, stiff and dark with old, dried fluid. The evidence of violence was clear, and the hasty, inadequate attempt to clean it away was more chilling than the blood itself. It spoke of an incident not logged, a problem contained not through resolution but through erasure and silence. The scratching echoed again, now accompanied by a faint, wet, dragging sound from a ventilation duct high in the shadows. They did not look up. They hefted the crate and hurried, their shoulders brushing, eyes fixed on the far doors. The Emperor's judgment was not just a vessel, Arden understood in a cold rush. It was an ecosystem, a haunted house of immense scale. Its dangers were not only the enemy without or the volatile plasma within. They were the things that lived in its deep, dark places, the things that scurried and scratched in the walls, the ghosts of past cleansings that left stains no scrub brush could lift. The ship was not their protector. It was a territory, and they were intruders in its hostile, hungry dark. They reached the far doors, cranked them open, and spilled into the marginally brighter corridor beyond, sealing the bay behind them with a final, thunderous clang that did nothing to mute the phantom scratching still echoing in their minds. The errand was complete, but the lesson was deeper than any catechism. The true enemy was the silence between the scratches and the ancient, indifferent hunger of the world they now called home. The observation of St. Drusus's day was announced not by bells or fanfare, but by a droning, pre-recorded litany that bled from every vox grill in the lower decks. The saint, a minor figure in the imperial pantheon associated with void-bound perseverance, was honored with a shift-long reduction in ambient lumen intensity. The already gloomy corridors and chambers sank into a deeper, more solemn twilight, the shadows pooling thickly in corners and behind. Machinery. It was a day of quiet reflection, the officers said, a day to contemplate sacrifice and the eternal vigilance of the Emperor. For the crew, it meant straining their eyes at their dials and trying not to doze in the oppressive dimness. Midway through the shift, a new command crackled over the Vox. All non-essential personnel were to observe a ceremonial act of appeasement. Observation was not optional. Throughout the chamber, pick screens flickered to life from their dormant, dusty housings. The images were grainy, monochrome, and shot from a high, fixed angle, but they were clear enough. They showed a stark, utilitarian airlock chamber deep in the ship's penal block. The chamber was small, its walls scuffed and stained. A single heavy viewport of reinforced crystal flecks looked out into the impenetrable black of the void. In the center of the floor was a painted yellow circle. Standing within it, motionless, was a man. He was from the penal crew, identifiable by his sackcloth tunic and the shock collar around his neck. His head was shaved, his posture slumped, his face a blank mask of exhausted acceptance. He did not struggle. He did not look at the pick camera. He simply stood, waiting. Two armsmen flanked the inner airlock door, their featureless helmets giving nothing away. A deck officer in a slightly less stained uniform stood before a control lectern, a data slate in his hands. The ceremony had the feel of a bureaucratic procedure, a quarterly audit of souls. The officer began to read from the slate, his voice tinny and distorted through the vox. He recited the name of the penal crewman, a string of numbers and letters, and listed his transgressions, repeated malingering, failure to meet work quotas, and the insidious charge of spiritual listlessness. The crimes were mundane, the stuff of everyday exhaustion, but here they were formalized into a death sentence. The officer then read a passage from the Drusian Canticles, a verse about the purity of void and the offering of imperfect matter to the emperor's gaze. The language was florid, archaic, utterly disconnected from the grim little room on the screen. The penal crewman was then asked, according to the ritual, if he volunteered his spirit to appease the machine spirit of the ship and honor St. Drusus. There was a long pause. The man's lips moved, but no sound was transmitted. It was likely a simple yes. Agreement was irrelevant. The ritual required the syllable. The officer nodded, made a notation on his slate, and stepped back. The armsmen moved forward. Their motions were not brutal but efficient. One took the man's elbow and guided him 3 paces forward to stand directly before the outer airlock door. The other remained at the control panel. There was no last meal, no final words. The condemned man stared at the crystal flecks, at his own ghostly reflection superimposed over the infinite black. In the plasma conduit chamber, the crew watched in absolute silence. No one whispered, no one looked away. Arden watched the grainy image, the scene feeling both profoundly intimate and cosmically distant. This was happening now, somewhere in the same vast ship, a mundane murder dressed in sacred vestments. The officer on the screen raised his hand. The armsman at the controls pulled a lever. A series of amber warning runes lit up around the outer door. A recorded, mechanized voice intoned, "Atmosphere purge in progress. Blessed be the void." On the screen, the penal crewman took a sudden, involuntary gasp as the air was violently sucked from the chamber. His body convulsed once, his hands clawing at his throat. Frost bloomed instantly on the crystal flecks. For a second, he was a blur of motion in the rushing fog of his own breath and freezing fluids. Then the outer door slid open with a silent, hydraulic smoothness. There was no explosive decompression. The atmosphere was already gone. The man was simply there one moment, and then he was not. The void pulled him out with a terrible, gentle finality. One frame, he was a distorted shape against the starfield, and the next, the screen showed only the empty chamber, the open door, and the endless, static black. The outer door slid shut. The amber runes winked out. The officer made another note on his slate, nodded to the armsman, and left the frame. The pick screen flickered and went dark, returning to its dormant state. The ambient lumens in the conduit chamber gradually brightened back to their usual dismal level. The droning litany from the Vox grills resumed. Around Arden, the crew returned to their tasks. A rating coughed. Another began the slow, ritual polishing of a dial housing. The sacrifice was over. It had been witnessed, logged, and filed away. The horror of it was not in its violence, but in its utter banality. The ship had demanded a life to soothe its ancient spirit, and the bureaucracy of the Imperium had provided one with the efficiency of a parts requisition. The man was less than a memory, he was a fulfilled form. Arden looked at his own hands on the control levers. The chill he felt had nothing to do with the chamber's temperature. It was the cold of understanding. This was routine. This was normal. His own life and every life around him was just as expendable, a token to be spent in the great, uncaring economy of the machine. The Saints' Day sacrifice was not an aberration. It was a reminder. In the Cathedral of War, every day was a holy day, and every breath was a borrowed one, soon to be reclaimed. The alarm was not a sound, but a physical assault. It began as a low, pulsating threnody from the ship's central Vox horns, a deep, resonant whoop-whoop-whoop that vibrated the deck plates and rattled the teeth. For a single, disorienting second, Arden thought it was another plasma fluctuation, a spiritual crisis within the conduits. Then the lumens died, plunging the secondary chamber into a darkness broken only by the frantic, blood-red strobe of emergency beacons. The whooping alarm was joined by a mechanized voice, toneless and deafening, that boomed from every grill. Hull breach drill. Sector ETA-7. All hands to containment stations. SEAL protocols imminent. The Emperor protects. Chaoses was immediate, but it was a chaos of rigid, terrified procedure. In the strobe light, the crew became jerking marionettes of shadow and crimson. They abandoned their stations, not fleeing but scrambling toward designated bulkhead sealing points. There was no time for ritual, only raw, claustrophobic action. Arden, his heart hammering against his ribs, was swept up in the surge of bodies. The drill was a hypothetical, the officers had said, a training exercise for a rupture in the engineering sectors. But in the screaming dark, with the ship's voice shrieking of breaches, hypothesis felt like prophecy. The corridor outside the chamber was a river of panicked humanity flowing against a current of closing doors. Massive, hydraulic bulkheads, each a foot of solid adamantine, were already descending from ceilings and sliding from walls with a groaning, final-sounding inevitability. Crews shoved and elbowed, not with malice, but with the primal need to be on the right side of those ceiling jaws. Armsmen, visible as hulking, red-lit silhouettes, directed the flow with brutal shoves and barked unintelligible commands. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone from overloaded systems and the sharp, animal scent of fierce sweat. Arden's designated containment point was subchamber Theta, a narrow maintenance closet 2 junctions away. He ran, his breath ragged, the strobe turning his vision into a series of frozen, nightmare tableaus. A rating falling, being trampled. A tech priest, mechadendrites flailing, welded to a console in fervent prayer. A descending bulkhead catching a trailing tool satchel and crushing it to splinters with a sound like breaking bones. He rounded a corner and saw the hatch to Theta, a round, heavy door like a bank vault S, already beginning its slow, clockwise spin to seal. A handful of other ratings were there, pounding on the metal, screaming for those inside to hold it. Arden threw his weight against the spinning edge, his boots slipping on the deck. For a terrible second it resisted, then yielded just enough. He and 3 others squeezed through the narrowing gap, tumbling into the darkness within as the hatch sealed behind them with a deep, resonant clang that felt like the slamming of a tomb door. Silence. Not true silence. The alarm's whoop was muffled but present, a deep, throbbing ache in the metal, but the sudden absence of the roaring crowd. The only light came from a single, failing glow globe in the ceiling, casting a sickly green pallor. The subchamber was a claustrophobic cyst, barely large enough for the 4 of them, walls lined with silent, dormant pump housings. The air was already stale, tasting of rust and cold metal. They stared at each other, panting, their faces ghastly in the green light. There was an older woman with a graying braid, a young man whose cheek was bleeding from a cut, a hulking brute of a man who simply leaned against the wall, eyes closed and ardent. Then the ship shuddered. It was not the normal vibration of the engines. This was a deep, lateral convulsion, a lurch that threw them all against the walls. The glow globe flickered wildly. From beyond the sealed hatch came a new sound, a distant, rising scream of escaping atmosphere, simulated for the drill but horrifyingly convincing. A vast, windy shriek that spoke of a great sucking wound in the ship's side. The lights died completely, plunging them into absolute, suffocating black. The scream of the void grew louder, mixed with the simulated, grinding shriek of tearing metal. The drill's scenario was unfolding in the darkness around their tiny, sealed bubble. In the black, terror became a tangible thing. Arden could hear the ragged, too fast breathing of. The others could smell the sharp tang of urine as someone lost control. His own chest was tight, his lungs straining for air that already felt thin. The raw, silent terror was not of death, but of this specific death. Being trapped in a dark, airless canister, feeling the cold seep in, the pressure drop, the final, agonizing emptiness. He pressed his hands against the cold hatch, feeling the immense, immutable pressure of the ship holding it shut. They were insects in a sealed jar, and the jar was shaking. The brute of a man began to whimper, a low, desperate sound. The woman whispered a litany, the words trembling and incomplete. Arden's mind conjured the image of the saint's day sacrifice, the man fading into the static black. That was a clean death, almost ceremonial. This was a slow, crushing, anonymous extinction in the dark. The shuddering intensified. A fine mist of freezing condensation sprayed from a pipe joint, coating them in an instant, brittle frost. The simulated breach. Scream reached a crescendo, then cut off abruptly. In the new, ringing silence, they heard it, a mechanical, grinding noise from the hatch. A deep, metallic clunk, then the slow, agonized shriek of metal on metal as the massive locking mechanism began to disengage. Someone on the other side was cranking it open. A thin sliver of blinding white lumen light sliced through the darkness, widening as the hatch spun counterclockwise. The brute sobbed in relief. Fresh, cold air rushed in, carrying the smells of ozone and promethium. An armsman's helmeted face appeared in the opening, backlit and featureless. A gauntleted hand gestured impatiently. The drill was over. Their containment had been successful. They stumbled out, blinking into the harsh light of the corridor, their bodies trembling, their souls still trapped in that shuddering, airless dark. The experience was not a lesson. It was a brand seared into the nerves. The ship could practice its own demise, and in the practicing make them taste the void. The corridor outside subchamber Theta was a tableau of controlled aftermath. The strobe lights had ceased, replaced by the usual grim lumen glow, now harsh and revealing after the absolute dark. The air still vibrated with the fading echo of the alarm, a phantom thrum in the teeth. Crew shuffled in dazed, silent clusters, their faces pale, their uniforms stained with sweat and frost. But the scene was not one of relief. It was one of audit. Armsmen moved through the throng, not as rescuers but as assessors, their featureless helmets scanning, their data slates recording. The drill was over, but its true purpose was only now becoming clear. The first body was near a junction where two bulkheads had met. It was a man, or what remained of one, pinned in the V where the massive doors had sealed. The hydraulic pressure had been immense, unforgiving. The corpse was crushed inward, the spine and ribs folded at an impossible angle, the arms still outstretched as if pushing against an immovable world. A dark, slick pool had spread beneath him, already congealing in the cold air. An officious-looking junior officer stood nearby, dictating notes to a servitor. "Seal integrity verified," the officer said, his voice devoid of inflection. "Component loss, 1 rating. Cause, failure to clear the seal zone in mandated time." The servitor's mechanical claw scratched the verdict onto parchment. The body was not a tragedy. It was a data point, proof that the doors functioned as designed. Further down the corridor, a more deliberate cleanup was underway. 2 armsmen were dragging another corpse by the ankles. This one's head lolled, a dark, ragged hole in the temple where a Las pistol shot had entered at close range. The dead man's face was frozen in a rictus of panic. A deck sergeant, his own sidearm still holstered but his knuckles white, was explaining to a recording cherub. Rating exhibited non-compliant panic, impeded the flow of personnel to sealed sectors, created a hazard, neutralized per standing drill protocol 7 alpha. The cherub buzzed, its single lens glowing. The lesson was explicit. There was a correct way to panic, a sanctioned form of terror that involved moving swiftly to your assigned coffin. Any deviation was a malfunction in the human component, and malfunctions were purged. The armsmen dumped the body onto a grav stretcher next to the crushed man. They were equals now, failures both, one claimed by the machine's physical law, the other by its disciplinary code. Arden moved through this gallery of sanctioned death, his own limbs heavy, the memory of the freezing dark still clutching his lungs. He counted 5 bodies before he stopped counting. Some were crushed, some were shot. All were being removed with the same brisk efficiency as a clogged filter or a spent power cell. The living crew stepped around them, eyes averted, their own survival a fragile, temporary reprieve. The message was woven into the very air, thicker than the smell of ozone and blood. You were either a functional part of the drill, or you were its waste product. A senior officer, his uniform adorned with more braid than most, appeared at the central intersection. He did not raise his voice. He spoke into a vox gaster, and his words echoed with calm authority from the overhead grills. Drill concluded. All sections report successful containment of simulated breach scenario in Sector Eta 7. Vessel integrity protocols validated. response times within acceptable parameters. The Emperor's judgment stands ready. There was no mention of the dead, no moment of silence. Their loss was not a cost. It was an expected statistical attrition, a necessary subtraction to prove the equation of survival. The drill was a success. The ship, the immortal entity, had tested its systems, and the systems, including the brutal one of human discipline, had functioned. The officer's declaration was not a lie. It was a statement of perspective. From the vantage of the bridge, looking at schematics and readiness reports, the exercise was flawless. The handful of broken bodies in the lower decks were irrelevant decimals, rounded down to zero. Arden returned to his secondary plasma conduit chamber. The familiar hum welcomed him back, the amber glow a constant, indifferent eye. He took his place at his station, his hands automatically finding the levers, his lips moving in silent litany. But the prayers were empty shells now. Inside, a colder understanding had crystallized. He looked at the pulsating conduits, the sacred machine blood of the Leviathan. He thought of the crushed man, the shot man, the trembling survivors in the dark. Their individual lives, their fears, their pain were not merely insignificant. They were antithetical to the ship's survival. The ship required obedience, not persons. It required function, not feeling. To be an individual was to be a potential point of failure, a loose seal waiting to be crushed, or a spark of panic waiting to be extinguished. The true purpose of the drill was not to teach them how to survive a breach. It was to teach them that they did not matter. Only the ship mattered. Its readiness was the only truth, and their existence was justified only as fuel for that readiness, whether as living hands on levers or as corpses that proved the bulkheads worked. The lesson was internalized, settling into his bones colder than the frost in subchamber theta. He was not a man serving on a ship. He was a nutrient in the bloodstream of a god, and the god was hungry, and it was always feeding. The sickness announced itself not with drama, but with a quiet, persistent wrongness. It began with a tremor in Officer Jaren's hands, the ones that had always been so steady with unguent flask and benediction. The faint shake was visible during the litany of cooling, a slight quiver that made the sacred oil bead unevenly on a coupling joint. Jaren scowled at his own. Fingers clenched them into a fist until the knuckles whitened and continued. But the tremor returned, and it brought friends. A dry, hacking cough started to punctuate his instructions, a sound like rusted hinges grinding. Then came the fatigue, deeper than the usual shift weariness. He would pause in mid-sentence, his pale, watery eyes losing focus, staring at the pulsating conduit wall as if reading a scripture written in the amber light. He forgot the sequence of the sevenfold psalm of sealing one shift, his lips moving soundlessly over a skipped verse. The other ratings noticed but said nothing. To comment on a superior's failing was to invite the attention of the armsmen, and the ship's medicine was not for the likes of them. Within weeks, the man Arden had first known as a gaunt but formidable pillar of ritual doctrine began to hollow out. Jaren's cheeks, already lean, sank into stark promontories beneath his eyes. His skin, always pale in the chamber's gloom, took on a waxy, translucent quality, webbed with broken capillaries that spread like fine red roots. The cough grew wetter, deeper, sometimes doubling him over at his station. He would straighten up, wipe his mouth with a greasy rag already stained with oil, and continue his whispered instructions, the words now rasping and thin. The radiation sickness, accumulated over a lifetime of breathing the charged air near the plasma conduits, of absorbing the silent, insistent poison through his skin and lungs, was calling in its debt. The ship was reclaiming the organic matter it had lent him. The Medici station, when a junior rating was finally ordered to take him there, was a place of stark, utilitarian indifference. Jaren was made to wait on a cold bench for 3 hours, shivering despite the chamber's heat, before a harried Medici servitor scanned him with a clicking, wand-like device. The diagnosis was a single, blurted binary code from the servitor's Vox grill. No treatment was offered. No bed was allocated. The servitor simply turned and trundled away. The rating helped Jaren back to the hab alcoves, where he was shifted to a bottom bunk near the foul-smelling sanitation duct. His duty shifts were formally terminated. He was now dead weight, awaiting processing. His final days were a slow erosion in the semi-dark. Arden, driven by a grim sense of debt, would bring him his own water ration after shifts. Jaren's alcove stank of sickness, a sweet metallic odor underlain by the sour smell of decay. He could keep little down. His body was a map of pain, joints swollen, skin hot to the touch. But his mind, in fleeting moments, remained in the conduit chamber. His eyes, glazed with fever, would fix on Arden, and his cracked lips would move. He was not speaking to the boy. He was reciting. Fragments of the litany of stabilization whispered into the stagnant air. The canticle of containment, mumbled as he clutched his thin blanket. The rituals were the last things to leave him, the sacred code overriding the failing biological software. He was dying as he had lived, in service to the machine, trying to appease the spirit of a ship that had already consumed him. The end came not with a sigh, but with an administrative decision. 2 deckhands from the sanitation corps arrived, their faces covered by rebreathers. They carried a stained canvas stretcher. Jaren was too weak to protest, a bundle of sharp bones and fever-damp cloth. As they lifted him, his hand fluttered out, grasping weakly at the air. His whisper was a dry leaf skittering on stone, the opening line of the hymn of sealing. They placed him on the stretcher and secured the straps. His head lolled to the side, his eyes finding Arden one last time. There was no recognition, no farewell. Only the faint, relentless movement of his lips, shaping the silent prayers that had been his life. They carried him away down the echoing corridor, the sound of their boots fading into the ship's hum, leaving behind only the sweet, sickly odor and a profound, empty silence. Later that shift, the deck officer tossed a small cloth bundle onto Arden's station. Jaren's effects, useless, but he marked you for it. The officer moved on, already forgetting. Arden untied the knot. Inside was a single object, a worn cogwheel perhaps 3 inches across. It was made of common iron, blackened with age and grease, its teeth rounded smooth from some long-forgotten minor function. It was cold to the touch, utterly mundane, a piece of scrap that would not merit a second glance in any parts bin. It had no sacred runes, no inlaid precious metals. It was worthless. Yet as Arden held it in his palm, he felt its immense, terrible weight. This was the sum total of Jaren's existence, the only physical artifact left behind by a man who had given every breath, every thought, every shuddering heartbeat to the Emperor's judgment. The cog did not symbolize Jaren. It had replaced him, the man with his memories his. Pain, his whispered litanies, was gone, processed and ejected like waste heat. The cog remained. It was a perfect, silent metaphor. Jaren had been absorbed, his humanity stripped away, his purpose reduced to this inert, mechanical fragment. He had become a part of the machine in the only way that mattered to the machine. He was gone, and a piece of it was left behind. Arden closed his fingers around the cold iron. It was not an inheritance. It was a prophecy. He slipped the cog into his pocket, where it rested against his thigh. a cold, hard promise of the fate ticking away for every soul in the roaring, sacred dark. The machine had taken Jaren, and it was hungry for more. The first impact was not a sound, but a change in the world. The deep, constant thrum of the Emperor's judgment's engines, the very heartbeat Arden had learned to feel in his bones, stuttered. For a single vertiginous second, the vibration ceased entirely, replaced by a profound and terrifying silence. Then the universe slammed back into place with a force that lifted him from the deck plates and threw him against the pulsating conduit wall. The impact was a physical roar, a deep-throated crump that traveled through the ship's skeleton, shaking dust and flakes of rust from the vaulted ceiling in a bitter rain. The amber glow in the plasma pipes flared into a violent, oscillating white, and the chamber's hum spiraled into a shriek. This was no drill. The ritual-lit calm of the lower decks was shattered in an instant, replaced by the raw, screaming physics of void combat. The macro-cannon broadsides began moments later. They were not distant booms, but immense, concussive reverberations that struck the chamber in waves. Each firing was a world-ending detonation somewhere in the ship's upper reaches, the shockwave transmitted through miles of armored hull and internal bracing. The air itself became a battering ram, punching into Arden's chest, compressing his lungs. With each titanic thud, the gravity fluctuated wildly. One moment he was crushed to the deck as if by an invisible giant's palm. The next, he was weightless, floating amidst swirling debris, tools, rags, droplets of sacred unguent, before being slammed down again as artificial gravity fought to recalibrate. A rating across the chamber, caught mid-stride during a lurch, was hurled into a bank of dials. The sound of breaking bones was lost in the cannon's thunder, but Arden saw the man slide down, leaving a dark, wet smear on the brass. Over the local Vox grill, the toneless, mechanized voice of the ship was drowned out by human screams. They were not screams of pain, but of sudden terminal absence. Section Gamma 9 vented. All hands lost. Breach on Deck 7, primary containment failing. The voice would cut off with a shriek of static or a wet, gurgling termination. Each announcement was a window into a tiny, specific hell somewhere in the vast ship. A compartment explosively decompressing, freezing its occupants into grotesque sculptures, a conduit rupture flooding a corridor with plasma fire, a direct hit vaporizing an entire gun crew. The screams were bureaucratic, clipped, yet they painted a panorama of simultaneous, multiplying deaths. The ship was bleeding air and souls into the void, and the Vox was its death rattle. Arden clung to his station, his fingers locked around a coolant valve wheel, the metal biting into his palms. The sacred levers and dials were now meaningless, their rituals a pathetic fiction against this onslaught. He recited the litany of stabilization, but the words were silent screams in his own skull, drowned by the cannon fire and the screams from the grill. He understood with a clarity that felt like a physical blow that this was the only true catechism. All the years of ritual, the scrubbing, the drills, the sacrifices, they were not preparation for service. They were the anesthetizing prelude to this moment. This was the reality of their existence, not the glory of the Imperial Navy, but the terrifying physical ordeal of being a microscopic organism inside a colossal beast as it was bludgeoned in the dark. A new sound joined the chaos, a high-pitched, grinding shriek of tearing metal, horribly close. The starboard wall of the chamber bulged inward with a deafening groan, the Gothic reliefs of saints cracking and shearing. A seam split open, not wide, but enough. The air became a hurricane, howling towards the rent, pulling everything not bolted down. Arden's breath was stolen from his lungs. He saw a heavy tool chest slide past, then lift and vanish into the narrow, shrieking gap. A rating, caught in the torrent, scrabbled for a handhold, his fingers leaving bloody streaks on the deck plates before he was plucked away, his final cry lost to the void's hunger. The breach was small, the ship's integrity fields already sealing it with a shimmering, crackling energy barrier, but the demonstration was complete. Death was not an abstract punishment for ritual failure here. It was a wind, a pressure, a random tear in the world that could pluck you out of it in an instant. The bombardment continued for an eternity measured in heartbeats and shattered bulkheads. Eventually, the frequency of the macro cannon strikes lessened. The gravity settled into a nauseating, constant sway. The amber light in the conduit stabilized, though it now pulsed erratically, like a fevered heart. The Vox grill fell silent, save for a low, persistent hum of damage reports and containment orders. The true war, for now, had passed over them. Arden peeled his hands from the valve wheel. They were bloodied, the skin torn. Around him, the chamber was a wreck of scattered tools, spilled unguent, and the one dark smear where a man had died. The surviving ratings moved like sleepwalkers, beginning the automatic, pointless task of straightening their stations. There was no triumph, no relief. Only a deep, trembling exhaustion and the acid knowledge that this was the purpose of the immortal ship, and they were the sensation in its nerves, the pain it felt as it killed and was killed. He leaned his forehead against the cold, vibrating conduit, the prayers finally stilled. He understood now. They did not serve the Emperor here in the dark. They were the sound the machine made when it was struck. The silence after the guns felt heavier than the noise. It was a thick, ringing void filled with the creaks and groans of the wounded ship, a beast licking its burns. No all clear was sounded. Instead, a new order rasped from the Vox. Arden's work gang, along with 3 others, was to report to the forward repair mustering point. They were to bring heavy pry bars, plasma cutters, and grav sleds. No one spoke as they collected the tools. The terms damage control or rescue were never used. The assignment was called a scouring. The journey to Deck Gamma was a descent through a ship transformed. Corridors they had traversed days before were now unrecognizable. Some were perfectly intact, the lumen strips flickering as if nothing had happened, a surreal pocket of normalcy. Others were choked with fallen conduit runs, their severed ends spitting angry sparks that illuminated the smoke-hazed air in stuttering flashes. The smell changed from ozone and promethium to something new and foul. The acrid reek of melted plasteel, the sweet, metallic scent of vaporized blood, and beneath it all, a dry, chalky odor that made the back of the throat itch, the smell of pulverized insulation and atomized bone. They reached the sealed bulkhead to Gamma's primary access way. A tech priest, 2 of his mechadendrites fused into a single blackened stump, worked at a control panel, chanting binary override codes. With a final, shuddering groan, the massive door retracted, and a gust of air, impossibly cold and carrying a fine, glittering dust, washed over them. The rating in front of Arden took a step forward and stopped dead, a low gasp escaping his lips. Deck Gamma was a nightmare landscape, a frozen diorama of violent death. The compartment had been a secondary munitions loading bay. The ceiling, 50 feet above, was peeled back like the lid of a tin, revealing the twisted, blackened skeleton of the deck above, and beyond that, a terrifying glimpse of the void through a shimmering, semi-stable integrity field. Stars glittered coldly in the rupture, indifferent spectators. The cold was absolute, a deep space chill that burned the lungs and made the metal of their tools stick to bare skin. Everything was sheathed in a brittle frost that glittered in the beams of their helmet lamps. The scene was one of grotesque sculpture. A loading crane was fused into a molten, abstract shape. Its metal flowed like candle wax before freezing mid-drip. Dozens of bodies were scattered, preserved by the instant vacuum that had followed the blast. They were not mangled, but posed. A cluster of ratings near a shattered conveyor were caught in a permanent, frantic scramble, their mouths open in silent screams, frost whitening their eyelashes and open throats. A lone armsman stood upright, fused at the boots to the deck, his helmeted head tilted as if listening, a long, crystalline spear of frozen hydraulic fluid protruding from his chest. They were not corpses. They were exhibits in a gallery of terminal shock, their final moments fossilized. The work gang's foreman, a man with a face like scarred leather, barked orders, his voice muffled by his rebreather. They were not there to recover the dead. They were there to clear the debris so the repair crews could begin. The invisible killer, the foreman gestured, was radiation. Hot spots from breached power coils and atomized munitions lingered everywhere, invisible, scentless, a poison that would cook a man from the inside over days. Their suits' dosimeter pins, small glass vials on their collars, would begin to darken with exposure. When a pin turned black, you were rotated out. If you were slow and the pin reached full opacity, the medikey would not treat you. You were already a dead man walking. The work was brutal, dehumanizing algebra, a frozen body blocking a primary conduit junction. It was not a former crewman, it was an obstruction. Arden watched as two ratings used a plasma cutter on one such figure. The blue-white torch flared, slicing through the frost-stiffened torso with a spray of sublimating ice and other matter. The separated halves were hooked with grapples and dragged onto a grav sled. The sled, already holding a twisted piece of machinery and several frozen limbs, was then sent humming toward a processing airlock where such debris would be ejected or recycled. The human material was processed with the same detached efficiency as the shattered machinery. Arden's task was to clear a path through a tumble of collapsed structural beams. The cold made the metal brittle. His prybar would chip off shards that flew like glass. His dosimeter pin, a pale yellow at the start, began to tinge with a faint amber hue. He tried not to look at the faces, but they were everywhere. A woman's hand, severed at the wrist, lay perfectly preserved near his boot, the brand on its forearm still visible. He used his bar to lever a beam, and the movement dislodged a helmet from a pile of rubble. It rolled to a stop at his feet. The frost on its interior grille melted from the breath of its last occupant, now refrozen into a delicate fractal pattern. He kicked it aside. It clattered against a frozen corpse, the sound hollow and final. This was the ship's true metabolism, he realized. It consumed promethium, it consumed plasma, but its most fundamental fuel was human material. It consumed their labor, their sanity, their health in the conduit chambers. And when battle came, it consumed their bodies in fire and vacuum. And then, in the aftermath, it consumed what remained, grinding them into logistical problems to be solved. Obstacles to be removed, matter to be cleared so the great wounded beast could heal and fight again. They were not just crew. They were the regenerative tissue, the self-replenishing resource. Jaren's slow fading, the sacrificed penal crewmen, the crushed and shot ratings from the drill, all were previews of this. Deck Gamma was the consummation. Here, men and women were not even granted the dignity of being broken components. They were debris. After 6 hours, Arden's dosimeter pin was a deep, smoky topaz. The foreman pointed a gloved finger at him and then at the exit. He staggered out, leaving the glittering, frozen charnel house behind. In the marginally warmer corridor, he leaned against a wall, his muscles trembling from cold and exhaustion. He looked at his blackened, frost-burned hands, then at the darkening pin on his chest. He was being consumed, too, cell by cell. The ship was feeding, and he was both its hand and its meal. The scouring of Deck Gamma was not a cleanup. It was a sacrament of digestion, and they were the enzymes, breaking down the dead to nourish the living machine. The boy was delivered to the secondary plasma conduit chamber with the same procedural indifference as a replacement filter coil. He stood just inside the hatchway, clutching a bundle of ill-fitting fatigues to his chest, his eyes wide and darting, trying to absorb the roaring, amber-lit world of the chamber. He was painfully young, his face still soft with the remnants of adolescence, not yet carved by the grindstone of ship time. The brand on his forearm was livid and fresh, a stark red wheal against pale skin. Arden, leaning against a conduit to ease the persistent ache in his lower back, watched him. He felt nothing, not pity, not annoyance. He simply registered the boy's presence as a new variable in the chamber's ecosystem, a fresh source of potential error. The deck officer shoved the boy forward with a grunt. "Yours, Arden, get him sanctified." The officer left, his boots clanging on the mesh. The boy stumbled, righted himself, and looked at Arden with a desperate, searching hope, the instinctive need for a guide in the terror. Arden met his gaze, and in the boy's terrified, confused eyes he saw a reflection. It was not his own face, but a memory. He saw himself, seasons ago, standing in this same chamber, his own brand burning, his soul reeling from the scale and the noise, looking to the gaunt, weathered figure of Jaren for some shred of meaning or mercy. The memory was clear, but it was like reading a data slate entry about another person. It held no emotional weight. He realized with a cold, factual certainty that he had become Jaren. The transformation was complete. He was no longer the agri-world conscript. He was the hardened veteran, his body a catalog of old strains and chemical burns, his mind a repository of ritual and survival calculus. The boy's terror was not a call to compassion. It was a liability. In the machine, fear led to fumbles led to death. The kindest thing, the only thing, was to crush that hope immediately, to replace it with the rigid architecture of doctrine before the chamber's spirit did it with fire. Arden pushed himself off the conduit. He did not smile. He did not offer a reassuring word. He jerked his head toward the primary regulator bank. "Here," he said, his voice a dry rasp that echoed Jaren's exactly in tone and emptiness. He began the instruction, the same brutal instruction he had received. He demonstrated the ignition sacrament, the flat palm, the two-fingered benediction, the firm pull to the third notch. His movements were mechanical, precise, devoid of any explanatory warmth. He recited the litany of awakening in the same rapid, toneless mutter, not caring if the boy understood the words, only that he mimicked the sounds. He showed the sacred unguent, the three-drop triangle, the sizzle of appeasement. He spoke of the machine spirit's wrath, of backflows and cleansing. Fires, his anecdotes of fused bodies and vented crews delivered in the same grim, matter-of-fact monotone. The boy flinched at every sharp gesture, his hands trembling as he tried to copy the rituals. He fumbled the flask, spilling a single extra drop of oil on a coupling. Arden's hand shot out, not to steady him, but to grip his wrist with a force that made the boy gasp. 3 drops, no more. You smother the spirit, it starves the joints. You want a radiation leak. You want to glow in the dark and cough up your lungs. The words were Jaren's words, the threat Jaren's threat. Arden released him, pointing at the spill. Clean it, penitent's psalm. Then the acid unguent, now. The boy scrambled to obey, his breath coming in short, panicked hitches. As the shift wore on, Arden drilled him, the canticle of cooling, the hymn of sealing with its 7 turns. He offered no comfort, no context beyond the immediate mortal danger of deviation. He was not teaching a person, he was programming a component. The boy's initial hope faded, replaced by a glassy-eyed focus on survival, the same focus that now lived behind Arden's own eyes. The cycle was complete. Jaren had poured his hardened knowledge into Arden, and now Arden poured the same hardened knowledge, unchanged, unsoftened by experience, into this new, empty vessel. The machine did not evolve. It replicated. The rituals were the same. The threats were the same, the fear was the same. The human material was simply fed into the front of the process, worn down and replaced, while the process itself ran on, eternal and unchanging. At shift's end, the boy was gray with exhaustion, his fresh brand standing out like a wound. He moved to his assigned bunk alcove without a word, his shoulders already beginning to hunch under the invisible weight. Arden remained for a moment in the now quieter chamber, the amber glow a familiar, oppressive blanket. He did not think of the boy's future, of the slow erosion that awaited him. Such thoughts were a luxury, a spark of individuality the machine could not afford. He pulled the worn cogwheel from his pocket, the cold iron smooth against his calloused fingers. He looked from the cog in his palm up to the vaulted ceiling, where endless, interconnected gears the size of hab blocks turned in the shadows, driven by forces beyond comprehension. The great gears turned, and he was a tooth on a smaller gear which meshed with another and another all the way up to those colossal wheels in the dark. His resistance, his pain, his fading memory of sunlight, it was all friction insignificant to be worn away. He accepted it, not with despair, but with a final, quiet relinquishment. This was his place. This was his function. He would tend the fire and the conduits. He would drill the next recruit and the next, until the radiation or a random tear in the hull claimed him. He would become a story told to frighten another boy, then a forgotten name, and finally, perhaps, a faint stain on the deck or a cog in another man's pocket. He slipped the wheel back into his pocket, its cold weight a familiar companion. He was a part of the machine now, truly and irrevocably. He looked up once more at the endless gears, their motion silent and immense, and then turned and walked into the corridor's gloom, his footsteps a tiny, rhythmic click against the thunderous heartbeat of the Cathedral of War.